Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to COVID-19 in Context. I'm Keith Mellinger, the Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of Mary Washington. I'm happy to welcome you back to our presentation. We're in week 4 of the highest enrolled class in UMW's history. Just a quick reminder that we do have the 2 boxes for you to participate at the bottom of the screen. The chat box is for you to share with us any technical issues that you're having, and that proved to be pretty helpful to us last week when we did have a Zoom issue with one of the speakers' presentations, and we got that fixed pretty quickly because we were hearing from some of you in the chat box. So thanks for that, and please use that if you see technical issues on your side. Also, of course, is the Q&A box, and that's an opportunity for you to ask questions to the speakers. So please get your questions in there and upvote the questions that you like, and we'll make sure those get asked first. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our speaker for today. I'm really happy to welcome the chair of our Department of English and Linguistics, Dr. Gary Richards. He's going to speak with us today about literary representations of cultural uncertainty during COVID-19. Dr. Richards? Here he comes. There he is.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this series of presentations. What I'm going to be doing today is in some ways a continuation of what Professors Delancey and Ock and Kim did last week thinking about art. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint. And I hope you all can see that. As Dean Mellinger said, my presentation is entitled Literary Representations of Cultural Uncertainty During COVID-19. And I'm using cultural uncertainty as a fairly broad term. It's going to refer to things like wars. It will refer to things like economic downturns and depressions. It will refer to things like natural disasters and, of course, disease. So the question that I, like the professors in art and art history, took up last week is, to some extent, why do we turn to literature, film, or other forms of art during moments of crisis, like during our current pandemic? And I want to walk us through some reasons we do this. What I'm going to be focusing on is art that is already created. There is a sense that frequently we turn to the creation of art, but I'm going to be focused more on art that is already created. And I came up with at least 6 reasons. I suspect you'll be able to think of others on your own, but I'll give this overview and then we'll go into the specifics. At moments of cultural uncertainty, we sometimes turn to literature and other forms of art for information about that crisis. We have anxiety, we don't know what we are encountering, and we want to have context for it. At the same time, we can also turn to art as a distraction from that crisis. We will often turn to art, as you'll see there in the 3rd bullet, as taking comfort in the familiar, narratives that we already know, beloved stories or movies or tales like that. We also will turn to art because art allows for there being deftly crafted articulations about issues that are associated with the crisis. And because artists have had time to polish their art, to craft it, they can frequently say with wit or eloquence what we sometimes struggle to say. We also turn to art, I think, for models of how imagined others have dealt with similar crises. They may not be exactly what we're going through, but it gives us narratives of how people have dealt with that. And then finally, we turn to them because we are seeking inspiration in how to handle crisis. I think Professor Kim, in particular last week, talked about art being a coping mechanism. She was looking at the art of Japan with that Zen Buddhist influences of how to provide calming. We're going to be turning to some extent with these Western forms today, literature that is meant to have content, but to provide us with inspiration. So when we think about the information that we are looking for in times of crisis, as Professor Rao presented on several weeks ago, we often will turn to our elected leaders, our appointed leaders. We will turn to health officials, and they can give us specific directions, information, rules we need to follow, but we may also turn, I think, to broader situations. And one of them, of course, is previous diseases. So this has been a long history of literary representations of disease. Here in the United States, for instance, at the very beginning of the 19th century, this was an era when there were frequent yellow fever epidemics. So you had a novelist like Charles Brockden Brown writing the novel Edgar Mervyn. It was set in Philadelphia during the 1793 yellow fever epidemic that was there. At the time, Philadelphia was the capital of the United States, and it lost about 9% of its population because of that yellow fever. So we might turn to that novel, for instance. Or if we go to the European tradition, we might think back to the literature that came out of, say, the bubonic plague of the 14th century. That was what Professor Delancey focused on, looking at kind of the art of Venice. If we go slightly west at the same time, thinking about Florence, there's Boccaccio's The Decameron, for instance, a series of stories that were told by a group of people escaping from the plague. If we go to the United Kingdom, to England, you might think about later iterations of the bubonic plague. So I've listed two things there at the top of the screen. One is Samuel Pepys's diary. Pepys kept this during an outbreak of the plague in London that struck in 1665. And it's a very personal account of that, as well as other things that were going on in London. And then Daniel Defoe, several years later, wrote kind of a novelization of it. The text is entitled Journal of the Plague Year, but it really is a bit of a fictionalization. Probably the most famous 20th century representation of the plague is Albert Camus' novel from 1947, The Plague. So we might turn to these narratives of disease to find issues that are being debated currently about information, how these diseases were handled. Another one you might want to think about would be turning to the literature of the AIDS crisis. We're thinking about the 1980s and 1990s, for instance. This is a logical place to turn, in part because we have a natural bridge with Anthony Fauci, who has taken such a leading role right now with COVID-19. He was already in one of those leadership roles in the 1980s and 1990s. And I've just given you a series of probably three of the most famous texts associated with that literature. So Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart, a play, Paul Monet's Borrowed Time, an AIDS memoir, and that's what the illustration is there. And then Tony Kushner's play, Angels in America. These may not have exact parallels to the COVID-19 pandemic, but they are raising a series of issues that might be pertinent for what we're discussing right now. So for instance, what role does a government have in managing a pandemic? What happens when a president, in this case Ronald Reagan, minimizes the dangers of that disease? How can effective treatment or prevention be developed? And just one final one, how does scapegoating circulate during pandemics? You might think about what's going on right now with COVID-19 being associated with a Chinese epidemic, that origin, in the same way that AIDS was associated with being a gay epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, there is a danger in investing in these narratives. We start to read them and we get invested in the characters, and if they don't turn out the way we want them to, we may be disappointed. I, for instance, started reading Camus' The Plague back in March. It hit too close to home, and I said, no, I don't want to deal with this. So what we do is often go to that second bullet I listed earlier, and that is look for literature or other forms of art as distractions. So one of the most popular ones, of course, would be binging on a television series on Netflix, something like that, where you just want an alternative to the current world. I have been turning to, say, Victorian novels, for instance, that it's going to be so different from what I'm experiencing, I can just lose myself in something that's going to take several weeks to read. This is also where we go to the familiar. Many people I know have been turning to, say, the Harry Potter books. They associate those with their childhoods, and so it's reassuring to reread those. Another popular one has been To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee's novel that ends with that famously reassuring image of after Scout and Jim have been attacked. Scout tells us that when they wake up in the morning, Atticus will be there and all will be safe. We're often right now at this moment of cultural crisis looking for narratives of safety. However, if we go to that fourth bullet point that I listed, we can turn to art for finely crafted articulations of issues that we may be struggling with right now. One of the significant tensions that we're facing as a nation and as the world right now is that tension between science and faith. Sometimes skepticism about science, not believing that the pandemic is real, not believing that the pandemic is as deadly as it is. And so as these debates have been going on, I have frequently turned to Emily Dickinson. That is Dickinson as a fairly young teenager represented there in the illustration. In this very short 4-line poem, she expresses which side of this debate she comes down upon. Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. It's short, it's pithy, and yet there is a very finely crafted artistry to it. Note the small details that she includes in the poem, including faith being placed in quotation marks. In the 1860s, when she was writing this, like today, that functions as a bit of a set of scare quotations. She's signaling her skepticism of faith. Also, the adjective she uses for it, it is a fine invention. How is it? It's fine, but it is an invention. In contrast, look at lines 3 and 4. Microscopes. Her image for science is what takes center stage. And instead of being just fine, they are prudent in an emergency. So Dickinson's in this very short poem is signaling, I think, her belief in science as opposed to religious faith at a moment of crisis. What I'd like to spend the majority of my time on, though, is those last 2 bullet points. And that's when we turn to literature, in particular novels. That's the valorized form we have in the 21st century, to look for models of how other people have handled cultural crisis. So I'm going to look first at 2 Southern writers. I happen to be teaching Southern literature this spring when we pivoted online, and Absalom was one of the novels that I was teaching. It's a notoriously complex novel by William Faulkner. That's Faulkner depicted there when he's in his 40s, I suppose. It is a novel in which, for part of the narrative, a man who has built a plantation is fighting in the Civil War. As the war is coming to its end, he is in Virginia. His 2 daughters, one of whom is a mixed race child of European American and African American heritage, and his European American daughter, as well as his sister-in-law, are isolated on their plantation. And this is often a section that is not concentrated on when we talk about this narrative. However, students zoomed in on these sections because it resonated with them what these 3 women were feeling at their in their isolation is what students were feeling to some extent in March and April at the height of lockdown. So I'll read the passage. So we waited for him. We led the busy, eventless lives of 3 nuns in a barren and poverty-stricken convent. The walls we had were safe, impervious enough, even if it did not matter to the walls whether we ate or not. And amicably, not as 2 white women and a negress, not as 3 Negroes or 3 whites, not even as 3 women, but merely as 3 creatures who still possessed the need to eat, but took no pleasure in it, the need to sleep, but from no joy in weariness or regeneration, and in whom sex was some forgotten atrophy, like the rudimentary gills we call the tonsils, or the still opposable thumbs for old climbing. A couple of things should jump out at you here. One is that sense of waiting. They're waiting for Thomas Sutton to come back, for life to resume again. And in the meantime, it's a world that's in limbo. There's no enjoyment in eating and going through the daily routines. And at least as Faulkner imagines it here, their identities are suspended. Race, gender, sex somehow get bracketed off. This very much echoed with students this spring. There was another passage that they turned to that seemed directly parallel. This is the same speaker. This is the sister-in-law, Miss Rosa Coldfield. We grew and tended and harvested with our own hands the food we ate, made and worked that garden just as we cooked and ate the food which came out of it, with no distinction among the 3 of us of age or color, but just as to who could build this fire, or stir this pot, or weed this bed, or carry this apronful of corn to the mill for meal, with least cost to the general good in time or expense of other duties. It was as though we were one being, interchangeable and indiscriminate, which kept the garden growing, spun the thread and wove the cloth we wore, hunted and found and rendered the meager ditch-side herbs to protect and guarantee what Spartan compromise we dared or had the time to make with illness. While COVID-19 for many persons has not been quite as drastic in reducing our lives down to bare elements of securing food, etc., this should, though, resonate with the way our work lives were rescheduled, were altered, so that people then had to do whatever was with least cost to the general good in time or expense of other duties. Even to that final passage about health, trying to keep yourself as healthy as possible so as not to have to deal with one more complication. In contrast, Margaret Mitchell, whose novel Gone with the Wind came out the exact same year, was widely read. Faulkner hated Mitchell, that she made a lot of money off of this, and it was pop culture. They could easily consume it. And what Mitchell does is, among other things in this novel, is show this very phenomenon that I'm talking about, and that is how people turn to literature at times of crisis. So that's Mitchell there in the illustration holding the original dust jacket on the book when it was published in 1936. At one point, there's a moment of crisis, and our protagonist, Scarlett O'Hara, turns to her sister-in-law, and they're trying to get through an evening of anxiety. And the narrative reads, Melanie sat down and with a hand that did not tremble, reached for a book on the table. It was a ragged copy of Les Miserables, that book which caught the fancy of the Confederate soldiers. They had read it by campfire light and took some grim pleasure in calling it Lee's Miserables. She opened it to the middle and began to read in a clear, monotonous voice. Slightly later, but something in the cool, soft voice reading the sorrows of Jean Valjean steadied her, kept her from leaping to her feet and screaming. For Mitchell, turning to literature for her characters is a form of therapy, something to soothe them. And this book was wildly popular in the late 1930s and early 1940s, in part because of the historical moment. It was the end of the Depression, the beginning of World War II, so many Americans were very concerned about how will we get through this era of anxiety, of cultural uncertainty. The book was also popular after World War II in both Germany and Japan in translation because it is a narrative of how you survive the aftermath of a war. So people turn to it for those inspirational messages. Largely this comes through the protagonist, Scarlett O'Hara, and that's Vivian Leigh in the movie depicting her. She, after the death of her father, is interacting with a neighbor, an elderly woman, who gives kind of the epitome of the code that Scarlett lives by. Instead of the zombie-like state that Faulkner's characters are in, Scarlett O'Hara is one of determination and drive, and you cut all nostalgia. You forget about the past and you cope with the present. So this is what that character, Grandma Fontaine, tells Scarlett. The whole world can't lick us, but we can lick ourselves by longing too hard for things we haven't got anymore, and by remembering too much. I'm practical and so are you. And when it comes to something that's unpleasant but can't be helped, I don't see any sense in screaming and kicking about it. That's no way to meet the ups and downs of life. I know because my family and the old doctor's family have had more than our share of ups and downs. And if we folks have a motto, it's this: don't holler, smile and bide your time. We've survived a passel of things that way, smiling and biding our time, and we've gotten to be experts at surviving. For people who might turn to Gone with the Wind during COVID-19, it is that sense of acceptance. Don't be nostalgic for the pre-pandemic world. You have gotten used to, I think, hearing the new normal. This is going to continue in Grandma Fontaine's speech when she gives the passage I'm about to read. The image there is from David O. Selznick's 1939 movie, and this is an iconographic image of Scarlett O'Hara vowing, know that she is going to conquer. If I have to lie, cheat, steal, or kill. It is one of individual determinism. She is going to make this. This is the advice that she's given. We bow to the inevitable. We're not wheat, we're buckwheat. When a storm comes along, it flattens ripe wheat because it's dry and can't bend with the wind. But ripe buckwheat's got sap in it and it bends. And when the wind is past, it springs up almost as straight and as strong as before. We aren't a stiff-necked tribe. We're mighty limber when a hard wind's blowing because we know it pays to be limber. That, my child, is the secret of the survival. Notice here the way this passage takes us back to the very title. Often when we see the title Gone with the Wind, we think about that which the war has done away with, Confederate nostalgia, for instance. In Grandma Fontaine's advice, it's instead what stays, what is able to bend and come back. So it is, I think, a model of inspiration for flexibility and determination. A third novel that I might want us to look at is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. In the image there, that is Henry Fonda depicting one of the protagonists of both the novel and the film, Tom Joad. The novel deals with a group of Oklahomans during the Dust Bowl who leave their family farm, which has been repossessed, and move to California, only to find there a series of economic depressions, of abuses, of being shut out from a workforce. All things that might be resonating, of course, with the economic downturn and the unemployment associated with COVID-19. If Mitchell focuses on kind of individual stoicism, you've got Steinbeck focusing on the community of people coming together beyond the family to support one another. So Tom Joad in the novel kills a man who has fatally beaten a labor organizer. And so he has to become an outlaw. And this is his famous departing speech. Throw out the cops that ain't our people. all work together for our own thing, all farm our own land. I'll be everywhere, wherever you look. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad, and I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry and they know supper's ready. It's kind of this romanticized notion that the entire group is going to be supporting one another, quite different from what Mitchell offers. As you've seen, both Faulkner and Mitchell trying to come up with metaphors, images that are really going to stick with us to underscore their inspirational model. Steinbeck was no different, and he famously, if controversially, ended the novel with this passage. The Joad family has gotten to California. They are virtually starving. There is a flood, and they've had to take refuge in a barn where, among other people, there's an elderly man who is literally starving to death. Their daughter, Rose of Sharon, has given birth to a dead child. She is still producing milk. And so this is the image that Steinbeck gives to end the novel. For a minute, Rose of Sharon sat still in the whispering barn. Then she hoisted her tired body up and drew the comfort around her. She moved slowly to the corner and stood looking down at the wasted face, into the wide, frightened eyes. Then slowly she lay down beside him. He shook his head slowly from side to side. Rose of Sharon loosened one side of the blanket and bared her breast. "You got to," she said. She swarmed closer and pulled his head close. "There," she said, "there." Her hand moved behind his head and supported it. Her fingers moved gently in his hair. She looked up and across the barn, and her lips came together and smiled mysteriously. To have one human being suckle another human being, literally partake of life-giving fluid, is a disturbing image, but one that I think Steinbeck was hoping to really show what kind of lengths we should go to support one another, even strangers. Now, there are many critiques to make both of this image and of the Grapes of Wrath in particular. In contrast to Faulkner and Mitchell, who, even though their depictions, particularly with Mitchell, are racist, there is still multicultural diversity acknowledged there. Both of the plantations in the novels come from Native American lands that have been appropriated by whites. That is documented. There is a diversity of African Americans on the plantations, including one slave in Gone with the Wind, who's of mixed race, both Native American and African American. In contrast, Grapes of Wrath is lily white. This is, after all, a family that moves from Oklahoma, a zone that was designated as Indian territory for most of the 19th century. They have moved across the desert Southwest to California, and yet Steinbeck never in any significant way represents Native presences, African-American presences, or Latinx presence. It's representations like that that contemporary African-Americans, such as Jesmyn Ward, have really worked to counterbalance. Unlike Faulkner, who suspends racialized identity at a moment of crisis, Jesmyn Ward in her 2011 novel, Salvage the Bones, which deals with an African American's coping with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, emphatically says that at moments of crisis, racial injustice is always present. And I think you can see how that's resonating with COVID-19 and then the concerns that have come out over Black lives, about police brutality and things like that. Like her predecessors, though, Ward is still trying to come up with a metaphor, an image that will resonate with us, that will give us a different kind of empowerment for how we cope. And she chooses a representation of motherhood that is radically different from the one that Steinbeck gives. She has a character that is a white pit bull that the narrator, her name is Esh, her older brother owns. And you'll see there in the image, that is the original dust jacket of the novel, has that white pit bull. She has just given birth. She is, however, sent into a dog fight with the dog that has actually bred her, the father of her puppies. And that dog has savaged her in the first round, bitten off part of her breast. It's a very violent, very traumatic image, but she goes back in and bests that other dog. And this is what I like to read now. Make them know, make them know, make them know they can't live without you, Skeeta says. China, that's the dog, hears. Hello, father, she says, tonguing Kilo, the other dog. I don't have milk for you. China blazes. Kilo snaps at her breast again, but she shoulders him away. But I do have this. Her jaw is a mousetrap, snapped shut around the mouse of Kilo's neck. When Kilo screams, it is loud and high, as if the wind whistles when it slides past China's teeth. Skeeta smiles. Skeeta calls, come, China. China spins, takes away part of Kilo's throat. There we have a maternal presence rather than pacifically suckling those in need, fighting, much like Scarlett O'Hara, for what she believes in. It's a real sense, I think, of energy and even aggression that Ward feels African-American communities who suffered so much during Hurricane Katrina might identify with. Okay. And here's a picture of Ward herself. The final thing that I'll say about this novel is it does share with almost all of the texts we've looked at this sense of a before and after, of there being, with cultural disruption, such a split between the way it used to be and the way it is now. This is after the hurricane has come through their coastal Mississippi town and they're surveying the damage. We pass what used to be the elementary school, the gym where Randall, a few days ago, played for and lost his chance at going to basketball camp and being recognized by a college scout for his talent, for being Randall, where Manny learned who I was and disowned me, where Skeeta fought for me, and there is nothing but mangled wood and steel in a great pile. And suddenly there is a great split between now and then. And I wonder where the world where that day happened has gone because we are not in it. Very similar, I think, to what Scarlett has to fight against, looking to the past, but acknowledging that world is different. We have to cope with the world that we are currently living in, including being in COVID-19. What I think these four examples have shown us is that these writers are always in search for symbols to give us images of coping mechanisms and perhaps to inspire us. So you've got Faulkner's Miss Rosa Coldfield and that image of the cloistered nuns, acknowledging the way that at these times our identities are sometimes suspended. And when we support each other communally, it's not always an easy thing to do. Mitchell, on the other hand, with Scarlett O'Hara, Grandma Fontaine, and that image of the buckwheat emphasizes, as I said, individual drive and resolve, that rejection of nostalgia and practical flexibility. Steinbeck does a 180 with Tom Joad, his sister, and the nursing mother. For him, it's a call for political resistance and valorized community support that goes beyond the family, even to sharing your body with the body of another to sustain that group. And then finally, Ward's protagonist, Esh Baptiste, and that female pit bull returns us to Scarlett with the individual drive and resolve, but she is going to valorize the sub-community, that is the community within a given race because of the dynamics of racial injustice that she sees being at work in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina and that we're seeing discussed today. Particularly for those of you who are in the class, if there's something that's not answered today during the question and answer, please feel free to write to me. Now I'm happy to return this back to Dean Mellinger and Professor Rao.
Dr. Richards, thank you so much for that terrific discussion. I think that as we've all experienced during this pandemic, that we turn to literature, as you noted, for inspiration, sometimes for escape, And there are a lot of really good questions that have already come up that I think will drive this Q&A, both tied into that and also, I think, drawing on your experience in literature to talk a bit about the role literature plays in our society. And so I'm really excited to hear how you respond to some of these questions. And the first one, which is one that has been highly upvoted, I think twice as many votes as any others, talks about something that I think many of us have discussed in the classroom and is certainly an important consideration. And that is the way that we reconcile modern standards with the way standards might have appeared in other times. And so when we look at past authors and some works that have been listed as part of the canon, some important works, we say that by current standards, they are considered racist, homophobic, sexist, nationalist. And as this questioner poses, says that Faulkner, Mitchell, Steinbeck are all subject to that criticism. But clearly you're still discussing these authors. So what's your answer to this? How would you reconcile to those who would remove their work from consideration? And if we are not going to remove their work from consideration, how do we help fix their position within an understanding of modern understandings of these standards?
I think one of the things for us who teach literature is we understand it as literary history. So we're looking at text as literary artifacts. That I guard against what might be referred to as presentism, that is judging artifacts from the past by contemporary standards. I think what is more productive, rather than in cancel culture, for instance, is rather to read those texts and to anatomize how they are racist, how they are sexist. What does it tell us about that community at that time? So for instance, I teach Southern literature. That usually begins the survey about 1820, when the South was starting to think of itself as a culture. And I teach pro-slavery documents in that class, not because I'm apologizing for slavery, but rather we need to know what was the culture thinking. So to understand why Frederick Douglass felt so empowered to write his slave narrative, who was he arguing against? So that's why I think that there is benefit in reading these texts and seeing what they might still tell us, even as we identify the problems of those texts, whether that is about sexism, bias against disability, all sorts of things like that.
So let me ask you a quick follow-up then, because I can certainly see a role for that within the college classroom. Some of the questions point to public education at different levels. Do you think that there's a role for that for high school students, for middle school students? And at what stage do we start to have those discussions?
That is one that literary scholars struggle with, and educators have and continue to do so. For instance, think about a text like To Kill a Mockingbird, frequently taught in high schools, and it has a broadly anti-racism focus, but it uses very problematic derogatory language for African Americans, and it sets up a white savior to come in to help the poor African Americans with Atticus Finch. I mean, so that sometimes is more difficult to handle, say, in a middle school or high school classroom. So I think it's hard. Sometimes those texts can be taught, but we know that any text can be approached from any different perspectives. So you might choose to focus on texts that can be read at one surface level, say in high school, and then be contextualized in deeper ways when you get into college.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks for that. I know that you and your colleagues in the department have never shied away from things like To Kill a Mockingbird, like another banned works of art. In fact, I'm happy to have read at your events that you have on campus, where people take turns, colleagues from around the community take turns reading from banned works of literature. And the next question addresses or asks specifically about banned works. So let me see if you have anything more that you could add to this. How long do you anticipate it being before readings and pieces are banned from schools based on the historical context and beliefs during the time in which the work was written?
I think it's going to depend upon the work, and it's going to depend upon the community. It depends upon that school. What are the values that are there? I would hope that at the college and university level, that things will not be banned. I mean, that it is useful, even texts that might be sexually suggestive. You know, I teach sexuality studies, among other things. I give students fair warning about what they might be encountering, because these are issues that you're going to be facing in your lived experience as adults. I think it's better to approach them through the safety of a literary text in the classroom with someone who can guide that discussion and create a safe space for raising doubts, things like that. So I would hope that at least at the college level, there are not texts that are banned. That said, I think educators and students need to be very careful to engage in a discourse of respect and understanding rather than dismissiveness, no matter where you might lie ideologically. And I think that's what a good college classroom should provide, is that safe space.
That's excellent. I really like the way that you present the educator as the guide, somebody that can help introduce students to literature that might be problematic or controversial or difficult. But the role of the instructor then to offer that introduction is really important. I think that's the perfect segue into the next question we have on the list, and that is about how do we incorporate more Black voices, Black authors into public education? You mentioned Jesmyn Ward, for instance, an excellent example. How do we do more of that? What is it that we need to do, or is it really up to the instructors to be able to serve as that guide to introduce our students to broader works of art?
I think it begins with those of us teaching at colleges and universities. We have to change our syllabi. We have to include those voices, because we're teaching the people who are apt to then become the high school teachers. And I think there's the danger, you don't just add contemporary African American, Asian American, Latinx voices, rather you go back and have those from the very beginning. So also go outside your comfort zone. I have taught Frederick Douglass 400 times. I sometimes like to put that master African American voice against a lesser known voice. So in an American realism class recently, I taught Ida Wells Barnett as an African American female journalist writing in the 1890s anti-lynching pamphlets and other kind of political tracts. So that we have to put those texts there. And I would also say move beyond a Black-white binarism. This summer, I was teaching contemporary American literature. We ended with Tommy Orange's 2018 novel, There, There, that deals with Native American representations. We want to be sure that there is a range of narratives that are in the classroom that we're teaching that then those students can possibly teach within those limits of sensitivities of text in high schools, but in those spaces.
Thanks a lot for that. Let's shift gears a little bit. There's been an awful lot of questions about other forms of art, not just literature, and I want to turn a little bit to the screen. We've seen recently movies about diseases and pandemics. Contagion was one. They've been having a moment of popularity. People want to watch movies right now about exactly what they're experiencing. Mm-hmm. And I sort of have my own opinion about why people might be attracted to that sort of thing, but I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that. And then just a little more broadly, how do you think the pandemic will influence movies, novels, books, and other forms of art moving forward?
Okay. I'll try to answer those two parts. The first one is, why do you think we're turning to disease films? And I think it goes back to those early bullet points that I was saying. We're looking for information. We're looking for parallel moments of crisis, but also that sense of we want to see survival. We want to know that we get past this, so that even if a lot of people die in those movies, somebody's going to survive. So that I think we're looking for that. If we turn to Gone with the Wind, Scarlett survives. If we turn to Salvage the Bones, Jesmyn Ward survives. I think movies are very similar to novels. We are creatures that invest in narrative, and we want to see narratives in which people get through this. How do they get through it? What are their supporting mechanisms? As far as, do I think there'll be COVID-19 art? There's already COVID-19 art. There is, for those of us who do literary studies, we often tend to focus on fiction and drama, to a lesser extent poetry, because those longer texts take longer to create, whereas the personal memoir, the short poem, flash fiction is being written even as we speak. This comes back to canon formation. How are we going to sift through this? What are going to be the great works of art for the cultural crisis? The comparison I make is to Hurricane Katrina. There were narratives coming out almost immediately after that hurricane, literally months just after it, but it really took a while. You will notice that Ward's novel, I believe, was 2011. So 6 years later for her to craft that. So I think there will definitely be COVID-19 art that is both more carefully formed and will take longer to create, but there is art out there right now. I go back to what Professor Ox said last week about museums seeking to capture the art that's being made, whether it's street art. Literature is trying to do the same things. I suspect by probably this fall, we'll see COVID-19 writing anthologies already out there.
Now, in a similar vein, there's another question that poses a similar question, but a slightly different angle, in talking about how so much of public discourse about COVID, for instance, finds it uncomfortable to talk about the history of pandemics and the history of this pandemic in particular. How do you think then, and this person's asking, how do you think that we will look to art to view how previous generations have looked to art? How do you think we might do that a little differently? Do you think the results of this will be different, be given our discomfort with looking at the history of our own pandemic and others?
I'm going to go back to Professor Delancey's articulation kind of about 14th century Venice. We think about, as she was saying, kind of investments in certain religious narratives. I think that because we're living in the United States, perhaps in certain communities in a more secular situation, you're not going to have those same narratives of faith associated with it, or religion. I think we're also going to have the internet at play here. If there's anything that has destabilized a dominant narrative in which we have the canon, so that Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind could be the Civil War novel, with the internet, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of narratives, artistically and otherwise, about COVID-19. And I think that's going to be a difference. It points a little bit to the crisis we have in publication, is that we know that people are not reading as much literature as they have been because they are reading other forms of discourse. So I think that there may not be the same pressure in the way that, say, the Civil War has been a moment of crisis in the United States that has been written to death. You know, that it was so overdetermined. I think that there's going to be various aspects of COVID-19 that will be handled in diffused ways. I think that may be different from the past.
So, Dr. Richards, I want to turn back to a theme that we've been to before, but ask you to expand upon it a little bit. Books like The Jungle, The Catcher in the Rye, they're uncomfortable, yet they teach valuable cultural lessons. And we've seen that throughout your presentation in the Q&A here. Does Gone with the Wind do the same thing in a way? Instead of dismissing it because it's racist and problematic, shouldn't we use it as a teaching tool? And for those who refuse to believe racism and white privilege are real. And moreover, beyond that, can you give us some other examples of other works that could be doing the same thing for us that we could be using as teaching tools?
Sure. I do advocate using a problematic text like Gone with the Wind in that fashion. If you're looking at the history of, say, women's writing in the United States, there has been a long bias against it. It is dismissed as being popular culture. We're supposed to read Faulkner, not Margaret Mitchell, and yet people were reading Margaret Mitchell. It's the same. We need to ask, why did it resonate? That's why I think, even though I don't do it, we need to ask, why are people reading Harry Potter? What is that cultural significance? I think Gone with the Wind, for all of its racism, and what I try to do is identify the racism. We create policies in classrooms about how we're going to handle the derogatory language. And once that is established, then we go through and talk about what makes those passages so problematic. But it's also that reminder of what that culture was like, both in, say, 1866 and in 1936, when Mitchell was writing it. It is a novel that is transgressive in other ways. So when you think about the stereotypical white Southern belle, you probably think of kind of Protestant Southerner. Scarlett O'Hara has an Irish father and a French mother. There is no English cavalier, and she is horror of horrors in the Protestant South, Catholic. So that you've got a protagonist that really unsettles that narrative. Many literary scholars have looked at Gone with the Wind as being supposedly the plantation novel, and yet it actually undercuts what we think the plantation should be. I'm trying to think of other texts that I find this useful. An example would be Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway has taken a lot of dings lately in the last 30 years for his gender politics, kind of the stereotype of the he-man in Hemingway. I routinely teach The Sun Also Rises because I think it is a case study, if you look at it carefully, about fragile white male masculinity. When that narrator has to attack African-American men, has to attack Jewish men to make himself feel better, I think that that's worth exploring Hemingway working through that. So that would be an example of a text that's not easy to talk about, the anti-Semitism, the racism, the sexism, but Hemingway's giving us a model of a really fragile male ego that's melting down. And I think that's fascinating. It makes for good art too. We love a good meltdown.
Everybody loves a good meltdown once in a while, right? A couple of questions ago, you were discussing, thinking about the canon and literature and the way that the internet has really destabilized, decentralized that. And you talked about having so many narratives. I mean, it ties in really in an interesting way to another question that we have from someone who notes that they're struck by how little time they've spent reading during this pandemic. They're just too distracted, reading too much social media. Yes. And they pose it as a question of, should we fight this? How do we make sure that we are recognizing the importance of reading books in modern times? So I certainly want to ask that part of the question, but also look at it from a slightly different angle that maybe suggests there's something positive about this, in that having it decentralized, we have more narratives. How would you parse this out?
This is where, I have to own my own nostalgia. Scarlett tells me not to be nostalgic, but I'm going to be. I grew up as a person reading books, so that for my mode of crisis, I turned to a Victorian novel. Of course, it saddens me in some ways that we're not reading as much as we perhaps used to with fiction, particularly because I think there are certain skills, there are certain benefits to mastering longer narratives, to doing that. At the same time, I don't want to suggest that I'm not compulsively reading news reports, that I'm not falling down the YouTube rabbit hole Last night, I went on a, dysfunctional Karen search and spent 2 hours watching Karen videos. I think that has value in our moment of anxiety, even as I think we ought to be reading texts like Faulkner, perhaps. And Professor Rao, remind me of your second half of the question you posed.
So the question about, is this something that we should be trying to go back to that nostalgic view of we need to be reading books, or is there something positive about the decentralized view of alternate narratives?
There's a little bit of a danger, even as we acknowledge kind of this diffuseness, when we think, say, about the high school classroom. This may be one of the few times that people are getting a longer text. There are only so many of those that can be taught there. I think it's valuable to do that. So we need to still be aware of what can be taught there, that high school students don't have that range of options to have that, as I said earlier, safe, controlled space with. So I think we do need to be aware of what's out there, because there are only a fixed number of slots we can put things in. Those need to be changed, but I think there's still value in putting a different novel in there. Doesn't have to be Gone with the Wind. It could be Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones, or what I try to do, put those texts in dialogue with one another.
Well, Dr. Richards, we don't have a whole lot of time left here, but I want to try to get one more question in here at least. Let's try this one. Faulkner references sex as something related to vestigial, unnecessary products of evolution. What cultural staples, handshakes, for example, do you think we're going to leave behind for good because of this pandemic?
That was not where I thought this was going. I think, again, going back to the AIDS crisis in the 80s, we are not only handshakes, but hookup culture. It's going to be very different the way that people of all ages, particularly going back to Professor Rao's suggestion about what are some of the benefits of the internet. The internet has remade our sexual lives. I think because of the pandemic of COVID-19, just like with AIDS, until there is a treatment, until there is a vaccine, we're going to be seeing so many bodies not interacting intimately, whether that's a handshake, whether that's a kiss on the cheek, or whether that's Saturday night.
Well said. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was terrific. I've gotten a lot out of this. I think we're about at the end of our Q&A here. I want to thank Dr. Gary Richards, Chair of the Department of English and Linguistics, for being with us today. And just a quick preview, we have a terrific talk on Wednesday coming up, the chemistry of disinfectants and sanitizers. And we have 3 of our faculty from the Department of Chemistry and Physics who will be joining us for that discussion. And I understand they're even going to demonstrate for us how to wash our hands. So I'm ready to tune in for that one. So students, will look for you in the small group discussions after we sign off here. And for everybody else, thanks for joining us on week 4 of COVID-19 in Context. We'll see you Wednesday afternoon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.